Thank you everyone for coming. Those of you who are attending online, those of you who are in the room, it's great to have you all with us. We're delighted to have you here today to discuss the latest investigation by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism by Misbah Khan on imported multi-drug resistant bacteria in poultry. We've got an amazing panel of people today, both online and in person. We have Catherine McLaughlin, we have Baroness Natalie Bennett, Dr. David Jenkins, Misbah herself, of course, and Colin Noonan from the Save Our Antibiotics Alliance. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce our chair. I'm just doing very brief introductions. So Dr. David Jenkins is the president of the British Society for Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, or BSAC. He's also a consultant medical microbiologist in Leicester. He's an eminent name in the field, and as a result, I will let him do most of the talking. Take it away, David.
Well, many thanks. So thanks very much, Paul. This is going to be a very interesting meeting today. First of all, thank you very much for the audience in the room for coming along. But also, we've got, I think, 70 or 80 people joining us online. So fantastic turnout. And it's the subject matter, I think, is worth the turnout. It's a very important matter. It's about life and death, and it's something which, generally speaking, the direction of travel is only going to get worse unless very significant and specific action is taken to address this. I think one of the concerns I have is that this problem that we'll be talking about today, which is effectively not only food poisoning, but the spread of antimicrobial resistance. By the nature of the food that we're talking about, it tends to affect primarily those people who have less money to spend. So that is a form of iniquity, which I think needs to be expressed and addressed. But antimicrobial resistance, like bacteria, are transmissible elements. They move from bacteria to bacteria, and bacteria move from person to person. So ultimately, we're all at risk. So it's something that should concern us all. I think there are elements of this story which read a bit like a thriller or novel. But I don't think that takes away from it. I think it just underscores the importance of all of this. It is dramatic, and it is something which is important to consider. So I'm very pleased to have a fantastic panel here, including the journalist who developed this, broke the story. But first of all, I'll introduce Baroness Natalie Bennett, who is a past Member of Parliament for the Green Party and is now a Green Party peer. She's the Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Antibiotics, which has been running for several years. It looks at antibiotics, but also antibiotic resistance, and not just in human medicine, but also in veterinary and animal husbandry and the environment as well. Many of you will have heard of the concept of One Health, and this is a concept which identifies and recognizes the spread of antimicrobial resistance through human medicine, through animal welfare and the environment, and sees it as a whole system.
That means you're going to have to change the order. That means I have to go and vote. Apologies, everyone. It's the illegal migration bill. It's a good cause. Cheers.
So we'll just let this.
Keep going for a while.
Well, okay. I'll carry on in that case. It's not a fire alarm. It's just a division bell, so you don't have to evacuate. So when Natalie comes back, we'll talk more about Natalie. But on my right, we've got Misbah Khan, who's an environmental reporter for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. The Bureau has been looking at antimicrobial resistance for several years now, in one guise or another. And so this is another element, another part of the work they've been doing. Misbah is has a BSc in biomedical sciences, and then decided to go into another area of life. She did a Master's of Arts degree in Near and Middle Eastern Studies, before joining the Bureau as a fellow in 2022. So this story is one of her first scoops, and so that's very exciting for you and that, as well as for us. We've also got Colleen Noonan, who's the Science and Policy Manager of the Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics. The Alliance is a 71-member organisation. It's been co-founded by Compassion in World Farming and also the Soil Association and Sustain. And these are organisations that are campaigning, amongst other things, against the overuse of antibiotics in livestock and farming. Colleen has co-authored numerous reports on antibiotic resistance and antibiotic residues, highlighting the human health aspect of excessive antibiotic use in livestock farming. Joining us online, we've got Catherine McLaughlin, who is the Chair of Responsible Use of Medicines in Agriculture, in RUMA, and also the Chief Advisor for Animal Health and Welfare at the National Farmers Union. She's also Director of Animal Medicines Training Regulatory Authority. In the past, Catherine has worked as a Scottish Extension Officer of the Milk Development Council and the Market Information Manager of Quality Meat Scotland. Hopefully you managed to hear what I was saying. If you didn't, don't worry, I'm sure we'll work out more of that. So I think what we'll do, and I think it probably makes sense actually to start with Misbah, because I think this is the story is really the focus here. So, Misbah, would you like to say a few words about the background of the story, how you got involved with it, what actually the story is?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jenkins, and thank you to Natalie Bennett for hosting, and also SOAS ICOP for organising the event, especially Sanjana for doing all the logistics behind this and getting it down so quickly. So basically, it started as all investigations really do in data. So we came across data from the European Medical Agency that looked at the sales trends of antibiotics for food producing animals. And we saw that there was a massive increase in antibiotic sales in Poland specifically. Although there were other countries that were ahead of Poland, we focused in on Poland because it's Europe's largest poultry supplier and the third largest supplier of poultry to the UK. When digging through this, we came across the salmonella outbreak that took place in 2020 and 2021, which has, supposedly been linked to 5 deaths, but also led to thousands being hospitalised. And we dug into that supply chain. And when we spoke to people in Poland on the ground, it seemed to be a sort of open secret in the farming community that there was antibiotic usage taking place on the farms. But what really concerned us was the types of antibiotics that were being used. We know that antibiotic usage in the farming sector is a massive problem with AMR, but in specific fluoroquinolones and polymyx and colistin, really, which are critically important antibiotics marked by the WHO, were seen to be increasing at, fluoroquinolone increase was at 77.6%, and colistin was about 97.3%, which is massive, considering that the rest of the EU, well, most of the countries at least, and overall was decreasing its usage of antibiotics within the livestock sector. So when that happened and we figured out that there was usage, we were thinking whether or not the supply chain we were focusing in on was using these antibiotics on the ground or not. And we were interested in the multi-drug resistance that was taking, that was part of the outbreak or not. So it was talking to farmers on the ground. There was a health risk that was posed to them in Poland in general, but then also this was being exported directly to, our plates. And like Dr. Jenkins mentioned, it's the inequity in this that really caught us, because it was the cheaper products that you get in these supermarkets that were, that were part of the outbreak. So there was a massive public health threat that was in the public interest for us to investigate. As some of you guys have read probably in the investigation, we found Superdrug to be at the center of the investigation at the time. There was multiple FOIs put in, and then we also had interviews on the ground, and we did some screening and testing of the antibiotics on this side of the food supply chain. So we tested this, we screened the bacteria, the whole genome sequences from the bacteria that was, and as Colin knew during the investigation, actually, he helped out with that. The whole genome sequences of the bacteria were fluoroquinolone resistant, which, you know, shows that the fluoroquinolone usage on those farms is actually leading to the resistance that we found. And then we also found, when we went back to Poland, we saw that farm samples in and around the farms were, you know, that were linked to superdrug also had fluoroquinolone resistance. So this is, like Dr. Jenkins has already mentioned, was, you know, shows how antimicrobial resistance can spread through to the environment and can impact all of us, not necessarily just our, you know, not just the public that was part of the outbreak in 2020. So yeah, and you know, it led to the investigation. You guys saw the results that came out, and it calls into questions how we've necessarily we've necessarily dealt with the outbreak, and also calls into the question about our food supply chains, considering that the supermarkets are, and you know, we, as the little Iceland, all supermarkets I'm sure everyone in this room and online has shopped at, still continue to source their Friday night chicken dinner, you know, from the same companies that are at the heart of this.
So there's a lot in there that you've just said, and I think it's probably worthwhile just elucidating some of this. So salmonella in chicken, you think, well, how do you get salmonella from chicken? You know, because presumably you cook it, but of course that depends on whether you've cooked it adequately or not. But also, it's also in the preparation, because you can contaminate surfaces and hands with raw juices while you're preparing the chicken. But where does the salmonella come from? And I have to kind of probably declare probably a disinterest, really, in a sense, because actually I don't eat meat. I haven't eaten meat for years. However, partly because I understand how it's produced. But the point about it is that what we're talking about here with salmonella is it's a gut organism. It's an organism from the gut of the chicken. Clearly, people in this country at least don't eat chicken intestines. So how does the salmonella get in there? Well, it's due to the butchering process, effectively, and you get contamination of the meat there. And whilst the salmonella is interesting in and of itself, and particularly the multi-drug resistance of it, element of it, it's also a marker of contamination with other gut organisms as well, such as E. coli and Campylobacter and various other things. So this is much more than just salmonella, isn't it?
Yes, so the samples actually that we found on the farms were E. coli. It wasn't salmonella that was drug resistant to fluoroquinolone. So you're very right on that front. You know, the resistance isn't just spreading to the gut bacteria, that's and salmonella, and it was to E. coli, and there are other bacteria that I'm coming, like, I can't remember the exact names of, but also, you know, but non-pathogenic that at the heart of this too, which, you know, a lot of people don't see it as threatening as such, because, and there's not a lot of focus on it, because if it's non-pathogenic, it's not going to cause disease in humans. But that doesn't indicate that it's not a problem. It still is, because of the fact that the resistance can transfer to other bacteria, and it is rapidly spreading across the supply chain. And as you mentioned at the beginning, the One Health approach in this makes it even more important. And I think you know, from reporting on this and obviously liaising with the health authorities and the civil service on this, there's a recognition that AMR is an issue. There's a recognition for surveillance, but there's no sort of enforcement of that surveillance. And, you know, actually there's quick movement when there's, say, a pathogenic bacteria that's been found to have that resistance, but there's no follow through if it's non-pathogenic as such, because it's like, oh, that's not our problem, that's somebody else's problem. And a lot of the time when we were going through this, there's a lot of passing the buck, in the sense, okay, this isn't under our jurisdiction, or it's not our like area of expertise, so we're just going to move this on to the next person, and it's going to be their problem. Even with the supermarkets, when we were liaising with them, a lot of the responses that we got back for this was the fact that it's on the consumers and they need to cook their chicken properly. You know, and so it's again, and that was the official advice that was given out by the FSA at the time as well, was the fact that they came up with numbers of, you know, a staggering amount of people not cooking their chicken properly. But then when I was digging into this, it was that you could get the salmonella off the chicken packaging, you know, itself in the freezer. That's where the bacteria was found, and for some of the cases that were infected was on the actual packaging within their freezer. So you know, it is taking that One Health approach and saying that if it's not our problem now, it will be later on in the future.
Right, many thanks. I think what we'll turn to Natalie now, because while you're here, while we've got you,
okay, well,
let's take advantage of you.
With a bit of luck, I'm told, I was going to say don't quote me, but actually you can quote me. The Tories are filibustering, so it may be quite a long while before the next vote. They're trying to push the votes as late as possible in the hope of losing fewer of them. So that's what's going on downstairs. Yes, sorry, I haven't heard the introduction, so I'll try and put in some things that might be useful, but if I'm about to say what someone's already said, someone stop me. So yes, I'm Natalie Bennett, one of the 2 Green Party members of the House of Lords, and I'm quite unusual in politics in having a scientific background. My first degree is agricultural science, so I can get really geeky about soils. But I won't do that today. But my involvement really with antimicrobial resistance as an issue started with the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, now Act. And I actually joined that just to help Baroness Cumberledge, who produced a really excellent report about how the healthcare system was failing women. And I was just going to do 1 or 2 things on that. But because I had a background in microbiology, I was just horrified to see that the government was utterly not getting the fact that we have to think about pharmaceuticals as their impact on the environment. And so ever since then, Paul Enguerrand, he and I actually had a debate on the BSAC blog, because I wrote a piece talking about factory farming and stating the Green Party policy that I believe that we have to end factory farming and that antimicrobial resistance is what I think politically will be the thing. There's so many other issues. The fact that factory farming is food waste. We're taking mostly perfectly good food and feeding it to animals and getting much less food at the other end. The problems of nitrogen and phosphate pollution. Look at the state of Herefordshire and the state of the East Anglia, chicken farms and pig farms. So all of those things. And Paul Enguerrand said, but Britain is really good. And that is true in terms of antimicrobial use. I hear ministers on a daily basis say, Britain is world leading in something or another. And this is a very, very rare occasion when it is actually true. And this goes back to the history of this. Is people might recall it was in early January, David Cameron actually made a major prime ministerial speech about antimicrobial resistance, pushed by Dame Sally Davies, who was then really had the right ears. And we have a really good AMR strategy. But as has been so very clearly exposed by Miss Barr and the team's work, as we learnt from COVID, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And we can do wonderful things in the UK, but we are going to import problems from around the world. And the reason why I think, I've in the last couple of days done 3 events that in one way or another related to antimicrobial resistance. And there is a real push on at the moment because Britain is about to renew that strategy. And there is an opportunity now. The APP, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, working with the WASH Parliamentary Group, has done some great work looking at the lack of sanitary facilities in the global south. And I thought I knew about these things, but listening to a midwife from Malawi talk about being in a health clinic and having beside the bed a bucket of water, and that was the entire provision in that maternity clinic. And many of those clinics, people get prophylactics, antibiotics from the day they go in for good reason, but what that's doing for AMR really doesn't bear thinking about. And so I think, I wanted to come along today particularly because it is really important that we understand this is no one is safe until everyone is safe, and that we can't just say we need the right strategies in the UK, but we need to think globally. We are back in the problem of factory farming. And I also put this in a broader framework, which is people may have heard of the idea of planetary boundaries. And people think about the climate emergency, and pretty well everyone talks about that now. The nature crisis, those are 2 of the planetary boundaries we've exceeded. Another planetary boundary that we've exceeded is what's known as novel entities, which is the worst named title ever. But novel entities for shorthand are plastics, pharmaceuticals, and pesticides. And so we have to think about the environmental impacts of our pharmaceuticals. AMR is a big part of it, but not the whole story. And so I think it's really important that we get this focus, get the mainstream media focus, and really get people talking about this and understanding this is, as David Cameron said all those years ago, a threat that is on the same kind of scale as the climate emergency.
Yeah, I mean, there was a very good paper published last year looking at trying to estimate global deaths from antimicrobial resistance. And I think there were close to 5 million deaths associated with antimicrobial resistance. I think 1.4 million directly associated with directly due to antimicrobial resistance. And those numbers are preliminary, but are probably unlikely to go up.
And actually, we had a briefing that Paul Longrand organised last week. The deaths from AMR in the UK are equivalent to breast cancer deaths, are equivalent to liver disease deaths. Yet where's the talking and the focus and the understanding?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stop interrupting you.
No. Okay, now, Colin, you've been mentioned already as being involved in this study. Would you like to discuss your role and how you...
Well, yeah, so I mean, I've been involved in the campaigning against the overuse of antibiotics in farming now for about 25 years. And as has been mentioned by Natalie, over the last sort of 8 or 9 years, we've seen some tremendous progress in the UK. We've seen farm antibiotic use fall by 55%, but there are still major issues there. And I also, at the same time as we've seen some major progress, this story that MISPA has revealed has essentially brought me back to some of what we were talking about back in the 1990s, because in some areas there's really been no progress. And one of the issues that we campaigned on right back in the 1990s was to end the use of fluoroquinolone antibiotics in poultry. And as a general rule, we don't campaign against antibiotic use in farm animals. We believe that it is possible to use antibiotics responsibly in farm animals, but it should never be routine, and that certain antibiotics are just too important to be misused in farm animals. Some should be banned completely, and some should have extra restrictions. And fluoroquinolones were introduced into farming in the early 1990s in the UK. And more or less immediately after the introduction of fluoroquinolones, we started to see fluoroquinolone-resistant salmonella infections in humans, fluoroquinolone-resistant Campylobacter in humans. None of this existed prior to the use of fluoroquinolones in farm animals. Fluoroquinolones were first used in humans. It did not lead to resistance in these bacteria. The evidence was so strong that by the year 2000, the FDA wanted to ban the use of fluoroquinolones in farm animals. It took them 5 years to do that because a pharmaceutical company sort of appealed the ban, but eventually they banned it in 2005. And Europe still, despite completely explicitly acknowledging that this is a very clear and obvious cause of Campylobacter that is resistant to fluoroquinolones in humans, has refused to ban it. Also, the UK has refused to ban it. It's quite interesting that we're here in a House of Lords committee room, because in 1998, a House of Lords report said that while fluoroquinolones could be responsibly used in individual animals under exceptional circumstances, it should never be used for group treatments. And that means it shouldn't be used in poultry at all, because in poultry, all treatments are group treatments. So there are two reasons why it shouldn't be used. First of all, because it's so clear that it is causing this Campylobacter resistant Campylobacter that is resistant to fluoroquinolones. And fluoroquinolones used to be one of the main treatments for Campylobacter in humans, and they can no longer be used because the level of resistance is now so high, far higher throughout Europe than it is in the United States, where they have far higher fluoroquinolone use in humans. And it's very clear and obvious that this is the cause. And it does highlight also one of the weaknesses of the UK approach, which, although we have seen 55% reductions since in farm antibiotic use generally since 2014, it has been due to voluntary efforts and not to regulation. And once you do things voluntarily, that means that when it comes to trade deals, you cannot ask your trade partners to do those things because you yourself are refusing to put it in law that you should not do these things. So the UK farming industry, after we relaunched a campaign to ban fluoroquinolone use in poultry in 2016, did, well, they were already making good progress in reducing their use of fluoroquinolones, but essentially by 2019, they had ceased using fluoroquinolones in chickens completely. But in the last couple of years, they've started using them again, unfortunately, at a much lower level, but they are still using them. Now, that means that if you are using them yourselves, you can't turn to your trade partners. And in some countries like Poland, Poland uses 38% of all farm fluoroquinolones in the whole of Europe. So out of 31 countries, Poland accounts for 38% of the fluoroquinolone use. This is massive misuse of fluoroquinolones. They account for 26% of colistin use out of 31 countries. Colistin is used as a last resort for life-threatening infections in humans. It shouldn't be used in farming whatsoever. And I think there's also another issue here is that well, we've heard that the UK is world leading. I personally wouldn't quite say that because I think there are countries in Europe that are ahead of the UK. And I would say that countries like Sweden and Norway and Iceland still have far lower use than the UK and have had so for decades. And Sweden banned the use of growth promoters about 20 years before the European Union and the UK did. But they also took action against all forms of group treatment. They reduced their group treatments by 97% over a period of about 30 years. But one reason they did this was not just because of antibiotic resistance, but because they found that there was clear evidence that some antibiotics are actually the cause of the spread of salmonella. In other words, that they kill off good bacteria in the gut and they allow certain bad bacteria to proliferate. A lot of antibiotics that are used in farming have been gram-positive, and that means they only kill bacteria that are gram-positive. And a lot of the food poisoning bacteria, well, all the food poisoning bacteria are gram-negative. And there's clear evidence that prior to the antibiotic era, there was far less salmonella around, and the introduction of growth promoters and of a lot of gram-positive antibiotics and of broad-spectrum antibiotics has helped to promote the spread of salmonella. So, I mean, I think we are seeing progress in the UK. Unfortunately, promises around regulation have not yet been fulfilled. The EU has taken some strong action. It's in some ways flawed, but it's far better than anything they had before. So last year, the EU banned all forms of routine farm antibiotic use. They banned using antibiotics for preventative group treatments. They banned using antibiotics to compensate for inadequate animal husbandry and poor hygiene. And the UK government repeatedly promised that it was going to implement these laws because it was still part of the EU when they were being negotiated. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Now, earlier this year, the UK did finally introduce its own proposals for regulating farm antibiotic use. And they are a very significant step forward in our view, but they do not go as far as the EU's laws, and they don't in particular ban preventative group treatments with antibiotics, which we think is absurd. They do, in theory, are going to ban routine use if these laws are adopted. But in our view, if you are preventatively treating 50,000 chickens or thousands of pigs, and that you have not diagnosed disease in a single one of those animals, that means that you are misusing antibiotics. And I think finally, I'd just like to say that I do think that, you know, at its core, this is a problem about animal health and welfare, and we need to be thinking about how we reform our farm systems to really achieve lower and more responsible levels of antibiotic use. The UK pig industry and poultry industry have made large amounts of progress, but we know that far more can be done if animal health and welfare and husbandry is improved.
Thanks very much. That's a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you. Catherine, can you hear us? Are you online?
I am. I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you very well.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, Catherine. We've heard a lot already from Colin about antibiotic use in animals. How do you respond to that? What would you like to add or challenge?
Well, I think Colin probably won't be surprised to hear that there are bits that I would challenge. First of all, can I just say thank you for inviting me on the panel, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Okay, so I chair the responsible use of medicines in agriculture. Just so that everyone understands, we were established in 1997 to promote the highest standards of food safety, animal health and animal welfare in the British livestock industry. We are an independent non-profit group, and we have a unique cross-sector role, comprising representatives from organisations covering all stages of the food chain. I think that's really important because it actually shows the huge level of collaboration and of coming together that the UK farming industry has shown. We've been very, very clear over the last couple of years. The Lord O'Neill report, as someone has already mentioned, was quite a catalyst for us. We've always been very aware of the responsible use of medicines. But when Lord O'Neill's report came out, we did stop, we did take note, and at that point we started to actually work collaboratively under a One Health approach. As everyone else is throwing around statistics, I think it's just worth actually kind of pointing out very clearly. We've been on a journey that's been robustly monitored and reported on over the last decade. The Veterinary Medicines Directorate, their report, their VARS report, which was released in November 22, shows that UK antibiotic sales for food producing animals have reduced by 55% since 2014, down to 28.3 milligrams per kilogram. And that represents the lowest sales to date. We've also got an 83% reduction in the use of HPCIAs for human medicine, and that equates to just 0.4% of antibiotics in farmed animals. Colistin, which has been mentioned quite a lot already, was not used in farmed animals in the UK at all last year. The industry voluntarily agreed not to use it unless absolutely necessary several years ago. So we haven't used it at all in the UK. And there's an awful lot that is going on within individual livestock sectors, all around the kind of prevention of illness and problems. So every sector is doing bespoke activity to make sure that the animals, the birds, the fish in those sectors are looked after. Prevention is always going to be better than cure, and that's one of the big things that we work on. So I think in response to your initial question, I am hugely proud of the achievements of the UK. I think we are doing a very good job. I think we are being very responsible. By no means are we complacent. We are striving all the time to stick by the mantra of prevention is better than cure, of reducing and refining and replacing antibiotics. We're encouraging our farming sectors to use preventative healthcare strategies, such as, kind of trying to make sure that animals are healthy, making sure that we look after them properly, Where there are vaccines available, we'll be encouraging vaccination as a good program of work. So I do think that the UK we can be very proud of what we're doing. And yes, there are major differences across Europe, but we have very different organizations and very different industries. I think Koilan mentioned the likes of Sweden and, kind of those countries in particular. They have hugely different climates. They have hugely different farming systems than us, different population groups. So I do find that, kind of sometimes it's very easy to simplify this, and it's actually a very, very complicated ผม So, as I say, I am hugely proud of what we're doing. So, I'm sure we'll come into it an awful lot more.
Many thanks, Catherine. We've got lots of people online, but also some in the audience here as well. And I want to encourage everybody to submit questions. And we can also take some questions from the audience directly here as well. But before we go to the questions, I just want to introduce Vanessa Carter. Vanessa, are you online? Oh, we lost Vanessa.
Yes, no, I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Hi, Vanessa. I just want to introduce you as someone who has personally suffered from antimicrobial resistance. Would you like to just describe what happened to you and for a couple of minutes?
Yeah. So I mean, I had a car accident. You can hear from my accent that I'm from South Africa originally. And I live in the UK. I've been here for about the last 2 years, 2.5 years. And so from the car accident, I ended up having a lot of injuries. But one of the most complicated injuries was to my face. So you can see from the damage that I had a facial reconstruction, and that sort of lasted about a 10-year span from the car accident. And I had a lot of prosthetics implanted. And in my 6th year, I ended up getting a infection, and I went through multiple surgeries. They did debridements and reconstructive surgeries until eventually they took the prosthetic out that was infected, and they sent it off for diagnostics. And I kind of questioned what's going on, and I realized, I asked for the test results back, and I got them, and I saw that I had resistance to a whole lot of antibiotics, and had MRSA, so resistance, susceptibility to different antibiotics. And we redid the facial reconstruction because by then I had so much damage done, and then I had osteomyelitis, bone infection, and they rotated antibiotics, and this basically lasted for about 3 to 4 years, and eventually I got over this infection. And so today I'm an advocate, I'm a patient advocate, and I work with different entities, including policymakers and so on, including in the UK and the WHO, and also trying now to sort of work in patient advocacy development, because this is a very big area that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So to kind of sum up at the moment, then we've got a situation where farming in this country has done a lot on a voluntary basis to reduce antibiotic use, and presumably has managed to do that through improving aspects of animal husbandry, and that presumably also has come at some cost to the farming industry. It's looking after animals well, it does require care, requires effort and investment. But on the other hand, we've now got a situation where we've got food coming into the country from other parts of Europe, where it appears that the hard work that's been carried out in the UK by British farmers isn't being there isn't a parallel improvement elsewhere. And in fact, it appears they're relying on antibiotics instead of good husbandry. And in a sense, that to my mind, that's should be something that farmers in this country should be really up in arms against, I would have thought, because it is undermining and undercutting not only the efforts that they've been carrying out, but also that the prices of the food is presumably cheaper than they would be that if it was sourced in the UK. And it strikes me we're effectively outsourcing our factory farming through this.
And it's perhaps worth saying that if you look particularly at the Australian trade deal, that's also true of rules about animal welfare on terms of stocking rates, on terms of the way in which animals are handled. And I think, to be fair, the NFU has tried to make a lot of noise about this. The government certainly can't say it doesn't know about it. But, Politico, the website, produced a rather good report, a very horrifying report of the day that basically Boris Johnson, just with a stroke of the pen, gave away the rights of protection, the food safety and food standard and animal welfare standards. It just got handed away like that.
So this is very concerning. Secondly, Misbah made the point about that these foods were primarily foods sold at a low price and therefore particularly likely to be bought by people on low incomes. And also, I was kind of underscored the point about the FSA seemed to suggest that the faults lay in the people preparing the food rather than in the regulatory authorities who have a duty to protect food supplies to this country. So I think there's a few things to think about there. Have we got any questions? Oh, does anybody from the, do you want to?
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think what the work that Misbah's done has shown, what we've highlighted throughout this discussion, is that this is fundamentally a political failure. This is a political issue. As you highlight, David, it affects people from lower socioeconomic classes who are going to be disproportionately buying these products. It's a result of failure in trade deals. As Colin pointed out, it's not something that we can enforce with our trade partners if we don't enforce it here at home legally. I think that the work that Room has done, that Catherine pointed out, is incredible. I highlight it every single time I can, whenever I'm talking to any stakeholders anywhere. The work that Room has done over the last 10 years is mind-blowing. Like, I don't think anywhere has seen a reduction as quickly or as effectively as what we've seen here in the UK through Ruma, which is entirely voluntary. And we're not at the levels that Iceland or Sweden or Norway are at, or Denmark. It's absolutely true. But the rate of change in the UK has been spectacular. But as you said, Natalie, it is no one is safe until everyone is safe. What we have is a government failure. We have double buy-ins in this country. As Catherine pointed out, collagen wasn't used at all anywhere in UK farming last year. But I was speaking with Grace Webster recently, who's in the NFU and AHDB as the head of the pig sector. There are high likelihoods that we will have to, or farmers will have to use collagen again in the pig sector because of market authorizations for zinc oxide-based products, which they won't be able to use next year. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds with it, but effectively we have a regulatory double bind where the UK is stuck with retained EU legislation that it's chosen not to get rid of, despite the retained EU law bill going through Parliament right now, where it could act effectively. And what that's going to result in is a 20 to 25% increase in aminoglycoside use next year in pigs, and potentially the use of collagen again, because the government has failed and continues to fail. We asked through Natalie, we asked a written question to the government specifically about the EU regulation that was mentioned by Colin, 2019-6, which is this regulation about prophylactic use of antibiotics, and whether or not the government was intending to ensuring harmonized veterinary antimicrobial stewardship within the European region by implementing a simple set of regulations. And the answer that we got back from the relevant minister was quoting Ruma's amazing success, 55% reduction, etc., and then saying, well, we don't have, we've currently prohibited the use of antimicrobials for growth promotion. That's been the case forever. That's not new action that the government's taking. And you're also not allowed to use certain antimicrobials which are important for human health. Yes, but not all antimicrobials which are important for human health. There are these massive addressable gaps that the government are just leaving on the table and choosing not to address. They could do so. They have the power to do it. And it would be such an easy win, especially for an electorate, which is calling out for, you know, a world-leading Britain. As you say, David, farmers are up in arms about this, but it's not being centered in the media to some extent. There's the Save British Farming Twitter account, which is often talking about this, and I think which interacts with the Save Our Antibiotics occasionally, at least on Twitter, I've seen this, who talk about this. But it's just not the mainstream narrative. It's not what we're largely hearing. And it is going to decimate British farming if we just let Polish imports undercut us.
And if I can just pick up your point, David, about inequality, and as Ms. Burrow has highlighted, that it's poorer people who are more likely to be affected by this. The government, I suspect, if they were here, a minister would somewhere along the line be grasping for the straw of, well, it has to be labelled and people can choose not to eat it if they want to, which of course, if it's the cheapest and that's all people can afford, that's one point to make. But also, this is a pre-COVID figure, so it may have changed somewhat, but it won't have changed that much. It used to be that a third of the calories consumed in Britain were consumed outside the home. So if you go down to the canteen downstairs below us, and there's lots of fuss about what happens at the canteen because MPs and peers are getting subsidised food, but most of the people who are eating down there are our security guards, our cleaners, our caterers, and people like that very often do eat in those low-paid jobs, very often do eat in canteens, etc. And, you know, I could try asking whether the chicken came from Poland or not, but that would be being really unkind to the catering staff, who would then run around tearing their hair out trying to find the answer because I've got a fancy badge. So the idea that people can protect themselves by personal choice is what will, and you know, this is the case of the quality of food and ultra processed food too. The idea that people genuinely have choices about what they eat, it's a total fiction, but it's the fig leaf the government often falls back on.
Oh, if you want to.
No, you go. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on a few points. Just to be clear that in the European Union, there have been countries that have reduced their farm antibiotic use by just as much or even more than the UK. So like the Netherlands has reduced its use by over 70%. And Europe as a whole over the past decade has reduced its use on average by 46.5%. That's on average. Poland is an exception in that Poland has increased its use, and with the exception of Cyprus, it is now the largest user of antibiotics in Europe. It's also the case that reducing your antibiotic use in the way that the UK has does not necessarily lead to increased food prices, and nor does it necessarily require improvements in animal husbandry, because the truth is antibiotic use in the UK, as in most of the world, was simply far, far too high. And a lot of the use was ultimately because people knew that it made animals grow faster. Even if they weren't being used officially for growth promotion, they were the same antibiotics very often that had been banned for growth promotion. So people understood that if they continued, if they were allowed to use them routinely, that they would do so. It was not necessary in order to keep the animals alive. And there have not been major changes in animal husbandry in the UK since 2014. It's also worth pointing out in the poultry industry, where there have been large cuts in the use of medically important antibiotics, there have been very large increases in the use of non-medically important antibiotics. And these are not used in human medicine, but they are nevertheless antibiotics. And the total use of those antibiotics exceeds the total use of all farm antibiotics in all species in the UK put together. So the use of these non-medically important antibiotics has been really key to keeping the poultry alive in the conditions in which 95% of them are raised. And then I think regarding the imports, another difference with the EU and the government's proposals is, well, although the EU was supposed to have by 2022 banned the importation of food produced with antibiotic growth promoters. They've in fact failed to do what their legislation required them to do, but they are still intending to do that, although it's probably going to take another couple of years. Whereas the UK government is not intending to ban the use, the importation of food produced with antibiotic growth promoters, which have been banned in the UK for UK farmers since 2006. And this it becomes more and more relevant as the UK starts to make trade deals around the world, including, you know, as we've heard with Australia, but also there's the upcoming trade deal with the CPTPP group, which has countries like, well, numerous countries which use antibiotic growth promoters. And, you know, just to give you an idea, Canada per livestock unit uses 5 times as many antibiotics as the UK. They're in the CPTPP. Japan uses 8 times as many per livestock unit. Vietnam, in 2 of its provinces, the estimates are that they are essentially using between 22 and 29 times more antibiotics per livestock unit than the UK is. Chilean salmon farming uses 10 times more antibiotics than UK fish farming. Many of these countries have extremely poor regulations. They don't collect antibiotic sales data. They don't have usage data, and they allow the use of antibiotic growth promoters. So I suppose one of the final points I'd like to make is that that reducing farm antibiotic use also, I think, as I've already said, doesn't necessarily increase costs. And so the UK is also importing food, some of it produced very intensively from places like Denmark and the Netherlands, that despite their intensive production of pigs, are using still significantly fewer antibiotics than the UK. So one way in which this can kind of make sense is that if you are not allowed to use antibiotics routinely as much, you kind of, as a farmer, have to look out. Even if you're still farming very intensively, you have to look out for infection a little bit more. And that can actually ultimately lead you to having less disease and actually reduce your costs. So it's not necessarily the case that reducing farm antibiotic use leads to increased costs. But clearly, when you import food from much poorer countries, very often it's going to be produced more cheaply because of labor costs and things like that, which actually are contributing even more. And if it's very poorly regulated and the UK decides to lift tariffs on it and to not set the same standards in terms of antibiotic use or other regulations, animal welfare laws, then clearly UK farmers are very much at risk of being undermined.
Can I add on from that? So it's, you know, throughout this process, a lot, and the way into this investigation was really about how do we, AMR and antibiotic use is always reported on a legislation basis or on a very abstract, like this, how many deaths are leading to, you know, and this is what, this is, you know, the new MRSA or whatnot. But what we wanted to drive with this investigation was really honing on to the companies that are, you know, putting these pressures on the farmers and themselves to produce chickens and other livestock at this rate, right? Because a lot of the time, and my editor can account for this, I was like, the farmers don't necessarily need to have to get the blame for this because they're trying to stay alive in a market or sustain themselves in a market that's incredibly competitive. And when you're sustaining yourself in that calls into question our entire food system as a whole, right? And my fear is the legislation is very, very important. I don't deny that. It's a vehicle, it's a tool that needs to be enforced. But a key thing on focusing on the company rather than focusing on, we could have very easily made this into just a Poland, you know, a Poland-wide story, but we focused on our company because that's possible. Because we live in a world where oligopolies. That's the word. Yep. Oligopolies are a thing, especially in our food sector, and that doesn't get recognized a lot of the time. We have a handful of companies that run our poultry sector, French, German, Dutch, and they're the ones that are using these antibiotics. Actually, throughout this process, we came across another report done by German Watch where, you know, French, German, Dutch companies had subsidiaries based in Poland under different names and were using antibiotics as well. So it's fair enough to say that all of these countries are doing a lot lot better, but they're going to push this. Now, right now it's at the borders of Europe, it will go further, and it already has started going further out to the global south, you know, and we are pushing this problem to the fringes, which is, it's problematic, and we can bring about as much legislation, but unless we put sanctions on these big companies that are used, and we had a chance to do that with Superdrug as well, but it got passed on. Superdrug continued, and we reported on this as well. 15 salmonella infections came out of Superdrug post the outbreak, even though they put in safeguarding mechanisms, and you know the government put in all of these restrictions and whatnot, but it wasn't ultimately held under account. If anything, they started doing shadier business on their end and started, you know, allegedly, it was so hard to talk to farmers on our side that we actually ran off farms because no one was talking to us. But it's sort of everything just gets shoved behind closed doors and becomes more and more illicit. It's you know, it's a way to actually kind of grab these companies by the collar and make them do something, rather than bringing about legislation that won't necessarily be enforced in the way that it needs to be enforced because lobbies exist.
Because what you're talking about there is illegal activity exposed. So it's not to do with legislation or further regulation, it's to do with enforcement specifically. So in relation to your expose, when you talked to the relevant enforcement agencies, what did they say?
Well, we spoke. So it was trying not to eyeball. Okay, when we spoke to the FSA about this,
Sorry, I mean
in Europe, in Poland. Now, okay, so Poland basically, and we put their comment into the piece. They said that, you know, there's no such thing as prophylactic use in Poland. It's not routine, and it's not, you know, it's not common. Now, I just want to bring into actually the report that's right in front of me. In 2018, an independent body called the Supreme Audit Office in Poland. The Polish own, you know, it's a regulatory body that keeps every single institution in Poland to account. They said, this is 2018 when antibiotic usage was noted as being increased. In every case examined, the use of antibiotics was justified by therapeutic considerations. However, the gaps in the supervision of this market are so serious that the official picture may not correspond to reality, right? Now, this is bearing in mind, and there was like the response to this report in 2018 was the fact that antibiotic usage actually for animal sector was going down. But from that point, when we looked at the new antibiotic sales, antibiotic sales figures, they went considerably even higher than they were even in 2015 at the time. So that's just taking that into caveat. And then also noting at the time that the fact when they did that audit, the issue was with the veterinary inspectorate in the sense that they weren't paying veterinary inspectors enough. There wasn't enough incentive for people with the qualification to come in. So it was quite interesting. People with like a master's in physical education were hired as veterinary inspectors instead. And that led to so many loopholes that the data that they were reporting was actually inadequate in itself to report back, you know, so this is the amount of salmonella that you have on farms, or this is the amount of AMR usage, or the antibiotic usage as well. A lot of loopholes, and we came across this while reporting the entire time as well. But the veterinary inspector maintained and did report back to us over and over again the fact that the Polish authorities have, you know, they are on top of this, and the fact that they are, you know, that there's no such thing as prophylactic use.
we like to provide sound effects.
So I suppose the logical conclusion to the information that you've sort of elicited is around, because we're in UK Parliament, specifically, what is the role of the UK
That's a very good question. I'm probably out of my expertise, but I think that's maybe.
Well, you're a legislator.
Yes, well, I think, as I was saying to a Tory MP this morning, when I was talking about pesticides, cheap food, quote unquote, is costing us the earth and costing us our health. And keeping people healthy, protecting them from avoidable harms, protecting them from, you know, what we're talking about with antibiotics ultimately is losing modern medicine. If we lose our antibiotics, we lose modern medicine. And, you know, you could die from scratching your finger on a rose thorn. That has to be a higher priority when you look at what's happening here. So, you know, food safety has to be an extremely high priority issue. And it's not just, of course, the person who eats that food or gets the disease from that food. It's the fact that you're bringing that whole organism, that whole resistance into the UK and potentially, as Misbah was saying, spreading to other things. I'm just going to, one sentence, pick up what Misbah said about oligopolies. There's a Canadian academic called Jennifer Clapp, C-L-A-P-P, who's done really good work on how the food system at each step along the way, from seeds companies to fertilizer companies, right through to multinational manufacturers, each one of those is dominated by 4 or 5 companies. And that, of course, also applies to our supermarkets. And I think it's interesting, we've just seen a big fuss about supermarkets not competing on fuel prices.
Yeah.
There's going to be much more focus. We do not have a competitive market anymore. What the Americans call trust issues are increasingly rising up the agenda in lots of places.
Well, and to go back to the producers, not only have you got oligopolies, but you've also got monopsonies, in that you've got 1 or 2 major buyers who can then set the price that they're willing to pay. And we've seen that with with milk farmers having to sell milk below the production costs in this country. And it sounds very similar to the challenges that the Polish poultry producers have in Poland.
One figure in the UK, if £1 you spend in the supermarket, 6p of that is likely on average to have gone to the farmer. So most of the cost of the food is not coming from the farmer. So if we're thinking about cheap food, the farm gate price is not the issue.
Catherine's got a hand up, I think, online. Catherine, is that right?
Well, look, sorry, when the bells go off, it's pretty impossible to hear what's being said. So I'm sorry if I don't directly answer some points. I'm really sorry. I think this is becoming quite a strange kind of debate, and it's jumping very quickly from a kind of science debate to a politics type of debate and a policy type of debate. And I think I just want to make the point that I think this is one of the problems that we've got. It all becomes very, very confusing, and there's an awful lot of mistruths and myths that then start flying around. And I actually feel quite sorry for an awful lot of consumers. Everybody has the right to eat food that is safe and that is of good quality and at a price that anybody can afford. And I'm not making any comment on how much income an individual has. We should all be able to buy food that, as I say, is safe, doesn't cause them any harm, and is high quality. I know in the earlier discussions there were a few comments around kind of differentiating food, knowing that your food is safe. The one thing that I will say, and this is very much me with my NFU hat on, the NFU, we have a lot of robust regulation, a lot of robust audited farm assurance schemes. Red Tractor, for instance, covers pretty much 90, I think it's about 97, 98% of those more intensively produced, kind of foods in the UK. All of those schemes have their medicine use as part of their standards, which means that they are robustly audited, they are robustly controlled. Farmers and vets have to work together. Everything is, things are recorded. It's all built into farm health plans. And that, I just want to make one plea, if this is all that we can take from this meeting tonight, one plea for consumers. If you're feeling in any way nervous about choosing food that is safe, that is high quality, and that is hopefully at a price point that individuals can afford, regardless of your price point, buy British. Look for farm assured stuff. Look for Red Tractor on the label. RSPCA. Just buy British. I know that sounds a really strange thing to say, but actually, I think we can probably, around the panel, we can all agree that we are, that's how you get safe, high quality food that won't hurt you. in terms of, I think, just kind of on the Polish issue, yes, it was hugely frustrating. There were an awful lot of my members that were angry about it, were upset about it. And I think, yes, questions have to be asked and questions have to be answered about how this individual company behaved like this. The one thing that I will say, and I think Coilen was making these points, but as I say, it was getting a little bit difficult to hear. There is an awful lot of good stuff going on around the world. It's not a horrible, kind of mess of despair and depression and, kind of irresponsible use of medicines. There is an awful lot in Europe that are doing good things. And as I say, this is a bit where, kind of we're all working towards One Health standards. I think the one thing that we do have to remember as well is that when we talk about One Health, that looks at agriculture, food production, human health, health, kind of hospital-acquired infections, what happens in the environment, biology. The whole thing is in this One Health agenda. And certainly for RUMA and for the meetings that I attend and the discussions that I have, that's increasingly becoming part of the language. And working on that One Health agenda, where everybody has a part to play in this, kind of breaking out and looking at the global health, that's how we'll actually start to solve this and how we'll start to kind of work through this. It's looking at the One Health agenda. So I think, it doesn't really help looking at individual countries and saying, well, that country's doing this and that country's doing that. We've got to start and be a bit more grown up about it. So, I hope that helps. As I say, I'm sorry if I've, as I say, it was very difficult to hear when the bells were ringing, and I know that's just one of the issues when you have a lovely room offered to you for an event in Parliament. It's just something that happens. But I do think that it's important that we acknowledge that there's an awful lot of good stuff going on.
I think that was very clear, actually. I mean, from Colin was saying as well, I've heard from other sources that RUMA have done, that the British farmers have actually done a fantastic job in reducing antibiotics. And you mentioned about hospital-acquired infections, and I know that if we'd been able to reduce antibiotic use in hospitals in the same way as farmers have reduced it, we would be in a much better position as well now. So I think farmers are showing the lead here. But I think the issue about other countries is, I think from the work that Ms. Barr's done, I think there are some very specific questions to be asked about this particular company and particular producer, remembering that 5 people have died and hundreds, maybe thousands, have had infections with these organisms. I think what we'll do is take some final comments from the panel now before we finish off. So I think we start from Colin and then Ms. Barr and then finish up with Natalie. I think that will be good.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on a point that Ms. Barr was making as well, which is that we have seen some aspects improving, in the sort of the center of Europe, as it were, and then problems, sometimes shifting to slightly poor. Well, Poland is growing very fast and is getting wealthier very fast, but nevertheless, it is less well regulated than in other parts of than in Western Europe, and this has led to a very rapid growth in intensive chicken farming in Poland, leading to it becoming the largest chicken producer in Europe. And so it's a very particular type of farming that is leading to this huge growth in antibiotic use in Poland. It's not the only country in Europe. Italy and Spain have similarly very high levels of antibiotic use and highly intensive production. highly intensive production in pigs, in poultry, intensively farmed calves, which have extraordinarily high antibiotic use. And one of the reasons why the UK, in addition to the efforts that farmers have made, one of the reasons why the UK is the 8th lowest user of farm antibiotics in Europe is quite simply that there are far more less intensively farmed animals here. So there is a lot of intensive farming, but there's also a lot of more extensive farming, sheep that are on grass, cattle that is on grass. And these animals, quite simply, not only do they not need the same level of antibiotics, they don't benefit from receiving antibiotics orally on a routine basis. And we know, so what this highlights is that the kind of farming that we are growing worldwide is leading to increases in antibiotic use. So despite all of the efforts that are ongoing worldwide and the very significant reductions that some countries are achieving, overall, farm antibiotic use is going up globally as we continue to intensify. And even in indoor farming systems, we know that there are great reductions that can be achieved by using less intensive methods. So by weaning piglets later, you do not need antibiotics to control post-weaning diarrhea. You can even get by without zinc oxide a lot of the time. By changing the breeds of animals, we can have healthier animals that don't grow as fast, but still produce healthy food and require far fewer antibiotics. By keeping animals in less intensive conditions, fewer animals per square meter, we can reduce the use of antibiotics greatly. And ultimately, I believe that by moving to more outdoor farming, giving animals access to the outdoors, we can really reduce antibiotic use massively, not by 55%, but by 90 or 95%. And that's what I think we need to be thinking about. And if we are going to be introducing laws which say that we cannot use antibiotics to compensate for inadequate animal husbandry or poor hygiene or lack of animal care, then these laws are going to have to mean something. They can't just be in law and that we don't actually take action on that. Europe has now got that in law, and we're going to see whether it's going to lead to any changes. I suspect it's not, and it's simply going to be ignored like other animal welfare legislation is ignored. For instance, the legislation which says that you cannot routinely tail dock piglets is ignored in the most of Europe, including in the UK, quite simply because the systems that we have do not permit us to avoid this tail docking. And the same is true in many countries in Europe regarding the overuse of antibiotics. It's falling, but it is still far higher than it needs to be because of the way the animals are farmed. And that I think, if we're going to really achieve responsible use, is what we are going to need to be looking at.
Thanks very much. Ms. Buff?
Well, I would like to just build on Catherine's point about, us becoming better than pointing fingers at countries, which I do agree with, because I don't think that's very productive. And just reiterate the point that, if we hold bigger meat firms to account on this front, because they're the ones that are, more responsible on that front for our food systems. It was, like I mentioned, even with Superdrug, 33% of the stake in that is through CP Foods, which is one of the biggest Thai food giants across the world. So again, French companies operating out of Poland, they're using the weak legislation there as a loophole to bypass it and exporting the meat to the rest of the world. It's not just Europe, it's outside of Europe as well. And I think more needs to be targeted towards these bigger meat producers and holding them to account, and rather than leaving a country, moving to another country and it just getting exported to another country outside. Right now it's Europe's problem sooner, and is actually not even soon. It is a global south problem. And I think we could go on this endlessly. But I think that's where the focus needs to be, even and enforcing that legislation so those companies are held to account as well. is where I would drive impact.
Thanks very much. And then finally, Natalie.
Well, I want to agree with Catherine, first of all, that farmers are doing their best under a system that is utterly grinding them down. And I've got no doubt that's true in Poland as well as it is in the UK, which I know a lot more about. And I think what we have is a broken food system. That's the underlying case here. And factory farming, we've focused here on antibiotic resistance, but we also talk about antimicrobial resistance. When we talk about AMR, it's often not clear which one we mean. I've been in a major grower of wheat and grains in the UK and seen his chemical shed and seen the wall of antifungals, most of which are the same drugs that are used in human medicine, or certainly the same families. And 50% of our arable land is given over to producing food for animals, mostly factory farmed, or biofuels. In the US, the figure is 75%. So people who say to feed the world, we're going to have factory farming, that simply does not add up. It's the other way. This is food waste. And we haven't arrived at this system by accident. It's not inevitable. I used to, in Australia many years ago, work on a dairy farm that was about a classically sized dairy farm, 100 milking cows. Every one of those cows had a name, and the farmer knew the character of each one of those cows. Farms like that have been forced out of business in the UK because they're not paid enough money to survive, and we've got giant factory production systems springing up instead. And that's not because people want to work in those giant factory systems. And just one final thought, I keep asking academics, and I haven't found anyone who can tell me, anyone who's done any work on this, but I have to think that farm workers and farmers, when they're working, treating animals with antibiotics, when they're with those animals in close contact, also when we think about abattoir workers who are very poorly paid people, I cannot, and there's some global south evidence for this that says this is the case, that antimicrobial resistance is a huge threat as a workplace safety issue.
Yeah.
And that's something we need to think about more as well.
There's clear evidence of that. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you very much for that.
Sorry,
It's been a vigorous discussion.
me?
Hopefully it's been enlightening for people, and we've learned a lot. Oh, sorry, right, yeah.
Sorry, could I just come in and correct a couple of points?
We can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. Okay, there's a couple of things that I would hate the audience to go away with this as an impression. Coilan made a point about outdoor raised being better. I just want to leave out there in people's thoughts. We're just going through, well, we've just kind of coming to a quieter bit in one of the biggest AI outbreaks, avian influenza outbreaks that we've seen in the UK. There are times when it is not possible to have animals outdoor, because then they will be challenged by disease, such as AI. They've had to be housed, because if they didn't get housed, wild birds, where we now know that AI is probably endemic in a lot of wild birds, they would have died through AI. And we have very little in the way of tools to deal with that. So, you know, kind of it's one of these kind of oversimplifications that gets touted around this debate and actually does the debate no justice. It's not about systems. It's about how we look after those animals in the systems that we have to work with. So, you know, kind of, and factory farming always gets to me. There is no clear definition on what a factory farm is. We do have farms in the UK that have 100 cows where everybody knows the individual names and characters of those animals. So we don't have this. We're not, you know, we're not full of these massive, intensive, you know, numbers of animals in feedlots in the UK. So it really frustrates me. I'm sorry, but it does really frustrate me, and it frustrates a lot of my NFU members that this is, as I say, it just gets oversimplified, and then we lose an intelligent debate. So I'm sorry to finish like this, but I just think.
Well, I'm to be honest, I don't think that was the impression we were talking about British farming. I think that was a criticism of farming in other countries, not so much in Britain.
Well, that probably highlights some of the complexities of these arguments and these kind of discussions that we have. We're not very clear on saying exactly what we're talking about, so everything all tends to get merged together, and people come away with unclear ideas of what the truth is.
Yeah. Very quickly say, I do appreciate some of what Catherine's saying about simplifying this issue. I'm the editor of the Bureau of the Environment team, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and it's our job to try and simplify very complex topics like AMR, raise awareness among the public of the serious public health threat that it presents. And what we need to try and do is kind of
speak into the mic, please.
And what we need to try and do is sort of coalesce. Do I need to press it like that? Just like that, okay. And try and sort of coalesce around a moment. Baroness Bennett said the same thing, that there's greater public awareness and good media coverage of the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the next one is
entities.
Exactly, the complicated one that doesn't sound that appealing, but it's our job to make engaging. So if there are any recommendations, Catherine, or any other panel members have on how we can better make this topic simple but engaging for audiences who have a right to know about where their food comes from and the potential health risks that it presents, then we're very open to engagement on that.
So to finish on, we need to talk more. We need to understand each other a lot more. We need to be more open about what we're doing and the consequences of that. So thank you very much. I will call it a day then, because I think we're going to be thrown out any second now.
Quite possibly. Yeah, well, no one's arrived yet, so there may be still some.
But let me just finish off by thanking the organisers of the meeting, Natalie's office, but also the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the School of Oriental and African Studies. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.